Okay, so in a previous video, you heard me mention the nephron a few times and a few of the moving parts. So let's take another look. Instead of my drawing this time, let's take a look at what we see. So this, this little red meshwork here in the center, they're calling it the glomerulus. Now, what leads into the glomerulus is going to be an afferent arteriole. So we see it looks like one here and one here. It's not specifying which is the afferent arteriole and which is the efferent arteriole, but one is going to be the afferent, one's going to be the efferent. So let's just, for funsies, we'll call that the afferent arteriole where blood's coming in, and then from this one would be blood exiting, going out. We're just going to make that assumption. I really don't know for sure because they both look like they are the same diameter. Okay, we have a glomerular capsule, and sometimes that is referred to as Bowman's capsule. Bowmans, Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule. So we have this Bowman's capsule, right? And really it would be like a ball. Just think of it as a closed off ball, but now we're cutting it in half, looking inside of that ball. So we know that there's an afferent, efferent arteriole, and there's glomerulus. There's blood that's coming in faster than it can exit. So it stagnates a little bit in here that allows for a little bit of filtration, and it's pulling some of the impurities out into the very, very first part of this tubular system. And the very first part of the tubular system that's closest to the renal corpuscle or Bowman's capsule is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's closest, and convoluted because it really does wind up a lot and get mixed up here. So if there's a proximal convoluted tubule, at the other end there's going to be a distal convoluted tubule, and right in between where you find the letter U, that's the loop. That's the loop of Henle, known as the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle. And since blood, if you look at the arrows and it's coming down this way, they'll refer to that one as the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Then this is the actual loop of Henle. I think Henle is spelled Henle, loop of Henle. And then it's going up, the filtrate goes up, so that's the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And then there's the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, and again, kidneys have millions and millions of nephrons. Okay, so again, you're going to have blood that's coming in right from the abdominal aorta into the renal artery. The renal arteries come in, and you remember from the renal artery was a segmental artery into from the segmental into interlobars, and then the interlobars went over into the arcuate, and then from the arcuate it was cortical radiates, and from the cortical radiate was the afferent arteriole. So the afferent arteriole came in to the Bowman's capsule, feeding the glomerulus. There's an afferent arteriole and an efferent arteriole. And then we're going to have the impurities pulled out in this direction here, leading in to the proximal convoluted tubule, and then the descending limb of the loop of Henle, then the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, to the distal convoluted tubule, eventually into the collecting duct. And these are connecting tubules. Okay, and notice we have this peritubular just meaning arteries and veins going all around the tubules. And that's because at any point in time, the kidneys and the nephron are temperamental. So we can have things in the filtrate, we can have impurities here, or maybe the body's getting rid of glucose, or maybe some water, or some minerals, and and then in here we can go, nah, don't want to get rid of it. Let's bring it back into circulation. Or maybe in here it's saying, okay, now we're in circulation, let's bring it back into filtrate. So it can go different directions at different times, different places. So the segments of the renal tubule, I pointed out the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, and the loop of Henle. The proximal convoluted tubule, that's the segment that's closest to the renal corpuscle or Bowman's capsule. It's usually in the renal cortex, as is the distal convoluted tubule. Those are in the renal cortex, but the loop goes a little bit deeper. It's in the medullary portion. Okay, you see these loops down in the pyramids. The filtrate is traveling in the tubules, so they call it, tubular fluid, and the nephron empties into the collecting system, which is really just a bunch of or a series of tubes that carries the tubular fluid away from the nephron, and it brings it into the collecting ducts, and it's going to receive fluid from many nephrons. So remember, at the end we had you can have something like this, and then maybe here there's a nephron connecting here, another one connecting here, maybe another one connecting in here. So you have all of these nephrons that have connecting tubules into the collecting duct. And from the collecting duct into the renal papilla, eventually it'll go into like that whole minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter. Okay. So the collecting ducts receive fluid from many nephrons, begins in the cortex and descends down into the medulla. It will carry the fluid into the papillary duct, which drains into the minor calyx. From the minor calyx into the major calyx. From the major calyx into the renal pelvis. From the renal pelvis into the ureter. Now, these proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, you see the PCT, we see the nephron loop, we see the descending limb, we see the distal convoluted tubule here, we see the collecting ducts. All I want to show you is that we have different types of epithelium at different parts of the nephron. So you see in the PCT, there's simple cuboidal epithelium. In the loop of Henle, there's simple squamous cells. In the ascending limb of the loop, there's simple cuboidal. In the distal convoluted, simple cuboidal. And you could see that based on the different types of epithelium, the thickness of it even, it will allow for the diffusion of certain elements. Maybe water can pass through certain areas, or salt can pass through certain areas. And what's unique and what's interesting is that you can see that the descending limb and the ascending limb are made up of different types of epithelium. So, like the descending limb and the ascending limb are different thicknesses. Okay, and that's going to allow for the diffusion of things to pass through. So through this area that's a lot thinner, we're going to have water pass through there much more easily. water can pass through here. And then and this is the descending limb, and this is the ascending limb of the loop. So through this part, you're going to have more salt. So we'll say NaCl, NaCl. So you're going to have water being pulled out of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then from that ascending limb of the loop of Henle, more salt. And salt and water are always drawn towards each other, right? It's just that the different limbs are going to be permeable to different types of substances based on the thickness or thinness of the epithelium. That's really the take-home message there. When you read up on the loop of Henle, you're going to hear of something referred to as the counter current mechanism. And the counter current mechanism is this relating where water is pulled out and where salt is pulled out. Okay. The renal tubules. So the main function of these renal tubules is going to be reabsorption, meaning we have the ability of returning useful organic nutrients that enter the filtrate back into your blood supply. That's reabsorbing it. Or we can secrete it, which is the first step, which is where the waste products that fail to enter the renal corpuscle through filtration at glomerulus, we can secrete that, and after it's secreted, you can excrete it. All right, so we're secreting the waste products that fail to enter the renal corpuscle through the filtration at the glomerulus. And much of the filtrate is reabsorbed, especially water and glucose and some amino acids and some ions. And secretion helps to manage the pH and rid the body of toxic and foreign substances. So secretion leads to excretion. Secretion leads to excretion. You can see here from this picture, really, really nice, and hopefully this kind of really puts it together for you. You can see the afferent arteriole on the top. We see the glomerulus encapsulated by the Bowman's capsule. So blood's coming in at a faster rate than it can leave. I wish they drew this a little bit wider because then it makes it easier to say that. So I'm going to make it wider for us, okay? A wider diameter. So the afferent arteriole is a wider diameter, which allows blood coming in faster than it can exit. Due to it coming in faster than it can exit, it stagnates a little bit and allows for filtration time. Okay, so that's number one, filtration. So number one, it filters. And then number two, maybe the body wants to reabsorb some of it back into circulation. Hey, let's reabsorb some of those ions. Let's reabsorb some of that glucose. Let's reabsorb some of that water. So it can do that. But maybe some of it wants to secrete. No, we got to get rid of this stuff. So it secretes it back into the tubular system, which would lead to excretion, number four, urinary excretion. So down on the bottom, excretion is equal to whatever's filtered, whatever's not being reabsorbed will be secreted. Okay, so the kidneys carry out the three basic functions, and the sum of these processes determines the rate of excretion, with the exception of proteins. Most substances in the plasma are filtered and then enter the Bowman's capsule. Okay, with the exception of proteins. We don't want the body getting rid of proteins. And just to show you what some of the substances that are being filtered, substances that are filtered, and how much of it is being filtered, how much of it is being reabsorbed, and how much is secreted, which eventually leads to excretion. So you see filtered column is here, how much is reabsorbed, and then how much is actually going to be secreted or excreted from the body. So if you look at water, right, there's 180 liters being filtered, and look, almost the same amount is being reabsorbed, but not, right? Not the whole thing, right? So some of it is going to become urine, but about 1.5 to 2 liters of urine a day. Okay. Look at the proteins. It's filtering about 2 grams. It's reabsorbing 1.9 grams, and it's getting rid of zero point 0.1. Look at the sodium. It's filtering 579 grams. It's reabsorbing almost all of it, but not, right? 575, and you're going to get rid of 4 grams of that. So if you look at these numbers and you look right down the columns, everything is pretty close, right? With the exception of, let's say, urea, right? 54 grams of it, and half of it is being almost half of it is being reabsorbed, and then the body's pushing out a lot of urea. Right? A lot of that urea is out in urine. Look at potassium, 29.6 grams, 29.6 grams, almost equal. Uric acid, look at creatinine, filtering 1.6. Body doesn't want to reabsorb this. This is an important one. The body doesn't want to reabsorb it. It wants to get rid of it. And this is one of the important tests right here. BUN is one. It's called blood urea nitrogen test. That's one important test to evaluate kidney function. And the other is called creatinine. So they'll measure the amount of creatine being pushed out into the urine. If creatine levels are very, very high, then there's a lot of breakdown of muscle tissue in the body, maybe a heart attack, breakdown of muscle tissue, also an indication of kidney failure. Okay, they're going to evaluate BUN, blood, urea, and nitrogen, and creatine. We're going to show you that as we move on a little bit. Um, Hormonal regulation of tubular reabsorption and secretion. You've heard of angiotensin 2, aldosterone, ADH, ANP, and PTH. These are really important. We'll talk about angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 when we talk about the RAS system. Um, Angiotensin 2, the effect of it is that it's going to increase the reabsorption of sodium and water, which will increase blood volume and blood pressure. And that's what angiotensin 2 does. It makes sure that blood pressure stays up. Aldosterone is really involved with sodium reabsorption. So it increases the secretion of potassium and the reabsorption of sodium. And if you hold on to sodium, you're going to increase water reabsorption, and that too will increase blood volume and blood pressure. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that's going to allow you to hold on to water. And if you hold on to water, you're going to increase blood pressure. ANP, atrial natriuretic polypeptide, that's going to have the opposite effect of aldosterone. So aldosterone and ANP, these are opposites. They oppose each other. This is going to allow the excretion of sodium in the urine. If you increase the urinary output, which is diuresis, it decreases the blood volume and decreases blood pressure. So aldosterone and ANP, these are opposites. And then parathyroid hormone, that's going to allow the increased reabsorption of calcium, right? PTH is designed to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. And if you're peeing out calcium, you're not going to increase the amount of calcium in blood, you're going to lose it. Okay. The opposer to PTH, if you remember when you did endocrinology, was calcitonin. So calcitonin was designed to lower blood calcium, and PTH was designed to increase it. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the renal capsule.